Sergei Ryakhovsky was a Soviet-Russian serial killer, convicted for the killing of 19 people in the Moscow area between 1988 and 1993. In June 1988, Ryakhovsky killed a man in Bitsa. The same year he killed 3 men in Izmailovsky Park. The majority of his victims were elderly women, although he also killed 5 men and 2 teenagers. His main methods of killing were stabbing or strangulation, and after the victim had died he mutilated the bodies mainly in the genital area. Some corpses of his victims would have sexual acts performed upon them. Ryakhovsky murdered a 73-year-old man, cut off his head with a hunting knife, and 1 day later returned to cut off his leg. His next victim, a 65-year-old woman, had her abdomen ruptured with a weak pyrotechnical device. He hanged, eviscerated, and then decapitated his penultimate victim, a 16-year-old boy, with a knife. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The Moors murders were carried out by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley between July 1963 and October 1965, in and around Manchester, England. They strangled and cut their victims' throats. The victims were 5 children, aged between 10 and 17, at least 4 of whom were sexually assaulted. The pair were charged only for the murders of 3 children and received life sentences under a whole life tariff. Hindley made several appeals against her life sentence, claiming she was a reformed woman and no longer a danger to society, but was never released. She died in 2002, aged 60, after serving 36 years in prison. Brady was diagnosed as a psychopath in 1985 and confined in the high-security Ashworth Hospital. He made it clear that he never wished to be released, and repeatedly asked to be allowed to die. He died in 2017, at Ashworth, aged 79. Frederick Walter Stephen West was an English serial killer who committed at least 12 murders between 1967 and 1987 in Gloucestershire, most of them with his second wife, Rose West. All the victims were young women. At least 8 of these murders involved the West's sexual gratification and included rape, bondage, stabbing, torture, and mutilation, strangulation and suffocation, engaging in acts of necrophilia with their bodies at or shortly after the point of death. The victims' dismembered bodies were typically buried in the cellar or garden of the West residence in Gloucester, which became known as the House of Horrors. Fred is known to have committed at least 2 murders on his own. Rose is known to have murdered Fred's stepdaughter, Charmaine. The couple were arrested and charged in 1994. On August 6, 1987, Rodriguez Vega killed 82-year-old Margarita Gonzalez. He raped and suffocated her and forced her to swallow her own false teeth. On September 30, 1987, 80-year-old Carmen Gonzalez Fernandez was found dead in her home. In October, Rodriguez Vega killed 66-year-old Natividad Robledo Espinosa, beating, raping, and suffocating her. Vega killed Carmen Martinez Gonzalez on January 21, 1988. On April 18, 1988 he killed 66-year-old Julia Paz Fernandez, who was also raped and suffocated. The other victims' identities were not released. Jose Antonio Rodriguez Vega was sentenced to 440 years in prison. On October 24, 2002, Rodriguez Vega was walking in the prison common grounds when 2 inmates attacked and brutally stabbed him, inflicting fatal wounds. Benjamin Atkins is an American serial killer and rapist known as the Woodward Corridor Killer. Atkins brutally murdered, tortured, and raped 11 women in Highland Park and Detroit, Michigan during a period of 9 months between December 1991 and August 1992. Although he has 11 confirmed kills, he is suspected of a further 11. Atkins was charged solely based on testimony and his own confession. Atkins chose young and middle-aged destitute women, often prostitutes or drug addicts. He raped, tortured and strangled his victims before abandoning their bodies in vacant buildings in Highland Park and Detroit, Michigan. He was sentenced to 11 life terms in 1994. In 1997, Benjamin Atkins died from an infection caused by HIV, while serving his 11-life-term sentence, at the Charles Ziegler Reception and Guidance Center in Jackson, Michigan. Richard Angelo, aka the Angel of Death, is an American serial killer who operated within Long Island and West Islip, New York in 1989. Angelo tried again and again, poisoning patients at the hospital and then saving them. Some patients were saved, others died. He was convicted of murdering several of his patients and sentenced to 61 years to life in prison. He has 8 confirmed kills but is suspected of killing more. He poisoned 26. After poisoning his victims, he would wait until they went into cardiac arrest, and then come by and save them in front of his colleagues. Angelo poisoned all of his victims by injecting a lethal combination of the paralytic drugs Pavulon and Anectin into their IV tubes. On January 25, 1990, he was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. Carl Werner was an American serial killer active in Northern California. Werner was convicted of murdering 3 teenage girls in 2 separate incidents in the San Francisco Bay Area communities of San Jose and Saratoga between 1969 and 1971. He had previously been a suspect in an unsolved knife assault on another woman. He stabbed his female teenage victims to death. At least 2 victims went to the same high school as Werner, Oak Grove High School in San Jose, California. 1 victim was stabbed over 200 times while the least stabbed victims received 49 stab wounds. Werner was briefly suspected of being the notorious Zodiac Killer but was soon ruled out as a suspect in that case. In 1971, Carl Werner was sentenced to life in prison at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California. Earl Leonard Nelson was an American serial killer, rapist, and necrophile, known as the Gorilla Killer, and the Dark Strangler, and at least once used the alias Virgil Wilson. He targeted and strangled landladies throughout the West Coast during 1926. He was known to commit acts of necrophilia, strangle, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. He was known to kill at both his home and the home of the victim. Nelson often carried a Bible to gain trust with his victims. Nelson's defense at his 6-day trial was insanity. Records were presented to show that Nelson had been confined in an insane asylum in Napa, California. During various periods between 1921 and 1925, in 1928, Earl Leonard Nelson was executed by hanging at the Vaughan Street Jail in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Jesse Pomeroy was an American serial killer known as the Boston Boy Fiend, the Boy Torturer, the Demon, and the Red Devil. In 1874, at the age of 14, Jesse started his killing spree. He was known to torture, mutilate, and murder his victims. At least 1 victim was tied, bound, and restrained during the crime. Pomeroy was arrested on April 24, 1874 at age 14, convicted on December 10, 1874 at age 15, sentenced to death by hanging, commuted to life in solitary confinement in 1876, commuted to life imprisonment in 1917 at Charlestown State Prison. Jesse Pomeroy died on September 29, 1932 at age 72. Cause of death: natural causes at Bridgewater State Hospital in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, U.S. Wesley Allen Dodd was an American serial killer and rapist known as the Vancouver Child Killer. His method of murder was stabbing and strangling. In 1989, Dodd raped and murdered 3 young boys in Vancouver, Washington. Dodd had an extensive arrest record for molesting children. By the time his behavior escalated to include murder, Dodd refused to appeal his death sentence. He stated that he should be punished to the full extent of the law, as should all sex offenders and murderers, and that if he ever escaped, he would immediately return to killing and raping kids. Dodd wrote detailed accounts of his murders in a diary that was found by police, and also writing down future plans for child abduction and also constructing a homemade torture rack for the next victim. Wesley Allen Dodd was executed by hanging in 1993. His hanging was the first in the United States in 28 years. The Palm Sunday Massacre was a 1984 mass murder in Brooklyn, New York that resulted in the deaths of 10 people, 2 women, 2 teenage girls, and 6 children. There was 1 survivor, an infant girl. All of the victims were shot with a total of 19 bullets fired from 2 handguns at close range, most in the head, and were found in relaxed poses sitting in couches and chairs, suggesting that they had been taken by surprise. In 1985, Christopher Thomas was convicted on 10 counts of manslaughter. The jury had convicted him of intentional murder, but the charges were reduced due to extreme emotional disturbance and Thomas being high on drugs. Prosecutors said the motive was jealousy, claiming Thomas suspected his wife of having an affair with the home's owner. He ended up serving just over 32 years before being released in 2018. Duke Pearson was an American serial killer and a former detective sergeant for the Spokane County Sheriff's Office, who was known as the Spokane Serial Killer. Pearson is connected to the deaths of 3 women who died in the summer of 1967. He began his career in law enforcement in 1959 as a Spokane County deputy. Pearson quit suddenly in 1966. 2 of Pearson's victims were pregnant with his child at the time of their deaths, his wife and his mistress. 1 victim disappeared after leaving a bar. 2 bodies were buried, and the body of his wife was found in the rear seat of a car inside the family's garage, with a hose leading from the exhaust to a rear window of the vehicle. Duke Pearson died of natural causes in 2019 prior to being arrested. His service was held at Keehee Funeral Home in Andalusia, Alabama. In 1939, Leonarda Gianciulli started her killing spree. During her crimes as a serial killer, she was known to commit acts of cannibalism, mutilate, and murder her victims. She killed 3 women and turned them into soap and biscuits. Known as the soap maker of Correggio, she baked tea cakes and made homemade soap that included a secret ingredient: human flesh. Her son was drafted into the Italian army, and she believed that the only way to protect him in battle was by human sacrifice. From 1939 to 1940, Gianciulli murdered 3 women at her home in Correggio, Italy, offering them a glass of drugged wine before killing them with an axe. She then cut up the corpses to make tea cakes, which were often served to her family and friends. Leonarda Gianciulli died on October 15, 1970 at age 76. Peter Tobin, a Scottish rapist and serial killer known to have killed at least 3 young women between 1991 and 2006. He was known to rob, rape, and murder his victims. He was captured after his final victim, Angelica Kluke, was discovered hidden under the floorboards of a church in Glasgow. A post-mortem examination later revealed she had been bound and gagged, raped, beaten with a piece of wood and stabbed in the chest 16 times. In 2015, Peter Tobin was left severely injured and permanently disfigured by a fellow inmate when he was attacked with a razor blade. Tobin died at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary on October 8, 2022, at the age of 76. On October 16, 2022, his ashes were scattered at sea after no relatives or next of kin claimed his body. Jack Unterweger was an Austrian serial killer known as Jack the Writer, Hafen Literat, Nast Poet, Vienna Woods Killer and the Vienna Strangler. Unterweger served 14 years in an Austrian prison for a murder in 1974. In December, Unterweger killed 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer, in a pattern that Unterweger would repeat again and again. He murdered Schaefer by strangling her with her own bra. He claimed that he had seen his mother's face in Schaefer's eyes as he killed her. Unterweger raped, strangled and killed at least 9 prostitutes after his release, then dumped their bodies in the woods. He was a small star in Austrian media in the early 1990s and was arrested in the United States, where he may have killed another 3 prostitutes. Jack Unterweger committed suicide by hanging himself in 1994 after being sentenced to life in prison. Yuri Straka is a Czech serial killer known as the Spartakiad Killer. In 1985, Straka attacked 11 women in Prague. His first victim died by suffocating on the dirt shoved down her throat, and the others died by ligature strangulation. He was convicted of 3 murders, 2 murder attempts, 5 rapes, 3 robberies, and 5 thefts. Due to his age, 16 years old, he could not be sentenced to more than 10 years in prison. During the investigation, Straka cooperated with the proceedings but expressed that he felt no remorse for the crimes, and that the only thing he was sorry for was being caught. In 1994, Straka's punishment was shortened by a presidential amnesty. In 2004, Yuri Straka was released from prison. He now lives under a different identity. Charlene Gallego is an American serial killer, along with her husband Gerald Gallego, were known as the Love Slave Killers and the Gallego Sex Slave Killers. Together they murdered 10 victims in Sacramento, California between 1978 and 1980. Some of their victims were kept as sex slaves for the couple before they were murdered. They were known to beat, rape, strangle, and shoot their victims, and inflict massive and fatal head injuries by a blunt instrument. Some of the victims were buried alive. They were arrested in 1980 when a witness reported the couple's license plate number to authorities. Charlene testified against her husband for a plea deal that reduced her prison sentence to 16 years and 8 months. In 1997, Charlene Gallego completed her sentence and was released. During an interview, Charlene claimed that she was also a victim. Ramon Escobar is a Salvadoran serial killer, known as the Homeless Serial Killer, who killed 7 people during a month-long killing spree between Texas and California in 2018. Escobar committed a series of homeless beatings resulting in 4 deaths. Several of the attacks were carried out with a baseball bat and at least one with a set of bolt cutters. Escobar was arrested on September 24, 2018 in Los Angeles, after a man was beaten unconscious and robbed. On December 18, 2018, Escobar was charged with 2 additional murders after confessing to killing his own aunt and uncle, Dina and Rogelio Escobar. Ramon dumped his relatives' bodies in 2 separate dumpsters, with their skeletal remains being found 2 months later in a landfill. He pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to several life terms without parole. Paul Dennis Reed was an American serial killer known as the fast food killer. Reed killed the employees of restaurants he targeted for a series of robberies during 1997. Reed moved to Nashville to attempt a country music career. In 1997, he was fired as a dishwasher from a Shoney's restaurant in Donelson for throwing a plate at another employee. He murdered 7 victims during 3 fast food restaurant robberies in Nashville and Clarksville, Tennessee. During most of the robberies, he would make victims lay face down on the floor and shoot them in the head execution style. 1 victim was stabbed and 2 were kidnapped. Their bodies were discovered the next day at the park. Their throats had been slashed. Paul Dennis Reed received 7 death sentences and died in prison in 2013. Clifford Olson was a Canadian serial killer known as the Beast of British Columbia. Olson confessed to the rape and murder of 11 children and young adults between the ages of 9 and 18 in the early 1980s. His victims were stalked, tortured, strangled with a belt, stabbed, suffered repeated hammer blows to the head, some were brutally mutilated, all were sexually assaulted. Olson was considered a dangerous offender. The sentencing judge recommended Olson never be released from prison. Olson's trial didn't last long. Initially, he pled not guilty to each of the 11 first-degree murder charges read out in court. 3 days later, he switched and admitted guilt. He had 3 parole applications, all were rejected. Clifford Olson died of cancer on September 30, 2011 while still in custody. Joachim Nikola was a vicious Polish serial killer who hated all women, known as the Vampire of Bytom, or Frankenstein. His mother rejected him and often had sex with boyfriends in front of him, and his grandmother handed out violent punishments on a daily basis. He brutally murdered 5 women in cold blood, and attempted to murder another 7 over 8 grisly years between 1975 and 1983 in the Upper Silesian industrial region. He would surprise his prey and bash them with a bludgeon about the head. Nikola attacked his victims with an axe, butchering and desecrating their bodies after death. Sometimes killing outright and other times incapacitating. He was also a necrophiliac. Despite his savagery, several women and girls survived his assaults. He was apprehended, sentenced to death, and hanged in 1985. Ladislav Hojer was a Czech serial killer and rapist known as the Cowardly Cannibal. He murdered at least 5 women in Czechoslovakia between 1978 and 1981. He cut off the breasts and genitalia of one of his victims. Hojer later committed acts of necrophilia on the genitalia before cooking the victim's body parts in salt water and committed acts of cannibalism on them. In 1982, Hojer was arrested after a mentally ill friend who Hojer had shown the scene of the crime, mistakenly confessed to the crime even though he was incarcerated at the time. His confession led to Hojer's arrest. Hojer confessed to 5 murders and is believed to have been responsible for at least 2 others. During the subsequent investigation, he indicated the existence of other victims. In 1986, Ladislav Hojer was executed at the Pankrat prison in Prague. Cody Allen Lejabokov, aka the Country Boy Killer, is a Canadian serial killer, murdering 3 women and 1 teenage girl between 2009 and 2010. Jill Stacy Stujenko was found dead in 2009 in a gravel pit on the outskirts of Prince George. Natasha Lynn Montgomery, her body has never been found. Cynthia Frances Moss, 35, her body was found in a Prince George park. Moss died of blunt force trauma to the head and penetrating wounds. She had a hole in her shoulder blade, a broken jaw and cheekbone, and injuries to her neck consistent with someone stomping on it. Lauren Dawn Leslie, 15, murdered on November 27, 2010, and allegedly met Lejabokov online at the website Nexopia. Lejabokov was sentenced to life in prison with no parole for 25 years. With 6 confirmed kills, Jenny Jones is a suspected serial killer responsible for the deaths of up to 60 infants and children in her care as a licensed vocational nurse during the 1970s and 1980s. She would use injections of digoxin, heparin, and later succinylcholine to induce medical crises in her patients. She was charged with poisoning 2 children. The doctor in the office discovered 2 puncture marks in a bottle of succinylcholine succinylmethonium chloride in the drug storage, where only she and Jones had access. Succinylcholine is a powerful short-acting paralytic that causes temporary paralysis of all skeletal muscles. A patient cannot breathe while under the influence of this drug. In small children, cardiac arrest is the ultimate result of deoxygenation due to lack of respiration. The exact number of victims remains unknown. Jenny Jones was sentenced to life in prison. Vasily Komarov was a Russian serial killer known as the Wolf of Moscow. Komarov was born in 1871 and is one of the earliest known serial killers in the Soviet Union. Komarov was a horse trader who murdered at least 33 men between 1921 and 1923. The victim would be killed with a hammer or sometimes have their throat slit. Police found 21 male victims, each discovered tightly bound in sacks, their bodies dumped on waste ground in the Shabalovki neighborhood. Komov confessed to 33 victims, implicating his wife Sophia as an accomplice. They were both found guilty of multiple homicides and sentenced to death. Komarov was convicted for the killing of 29 victims. Sophia and Vasily Komarov were both executed on June 18, 1923. Robin Ligas was an English serial killer, mental patient, and drug addict. Known as the Shropshire Murderer, Ligas started murdering people for money to buy drugs. He was convicted of robbing and brutally bludgeoning 3 men to death with an iron bar in Shropshire in 1994. Trevor Bradley, aged 53, found in a burned-out car in Melverley. Brian Coles, aged 57, found in his home in Higher Heath near Whitchurch, having been beaten to death with an iron bar. Robert Young, aged 75, killed in Shrewsbury during a burglary of his home. Ligas was charged with 3 additional murders, found guilty of 2, sentenced to life in prison in 1996, ordered to be detained indefinitely in a secure mental hospital in 2011. Ligas died on December 16, 2022 at the age of 70. Travis Victor Alexander was murdered by his ex-girlfriend, Jodi Ann Arias, in his house in Mesa, Arizona. Alexander was murdered on Wednesday, June 4, 2008. He suffered 27 stab wounds, a slit throat, and a gunshot wound to the head. His jugular vein, common carotid artery, and trachea had been slashed. He had defensive wounds on his hands. Alexander may have already been dead at the time the gunshot was inflicted. Photos taken moments later show an individual believed to be Alexander profusely bleeding on the bathroom floor. Alexander's death was ruled a homicide. He was buried at Riverside's Olivewood Memorial Park Cemetery. Arias was convicted of first-degree murder on May 8, 2013 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on April 13, 2015. Stanislaw Modzelewski was a Polish serial killer known as the Vampire of Gakowek, who brutally murdered 7 women between the ages of 18 and 87, by strangling them with a scarf, or with his bare hands. He also attempted to murder 6 others. He took valuables as well as useless objects from his victims which he then threw away. He executed them with utmost cruelty. The murders also had a sexual motive. The lower part of the victims' bodies were nude and the arrangement of the corpse suggested a penetration of genital organs. Modzelewski was a sadist, but it was not verified whether he mutilated the victims before or after the murder, although he is believed to have murdered an 8th victim, which he confessed to. It was never proven as the body was never found. He was sentenced to death and the execution by hanging was carried out in November 1969, in Warsaw. Wang Qiang was a Chinese serial killer, rapist, and necrophile, known as the Super Killer. He killed 45 and raped 10 from 1995 to 2003 in Budayuan Town, Quandian County, Liaoning Province, China, and is one of the most notorious murderers and rapists in Chinese history. Wang grew up in the small village of Kaiwan, Liaoning City. His father was abusive, addicted to drinking and gambling, and denied Wang the chance to enter school. Wang committed his first murder on January 22, 1995. Wang Qiang would rob, beat, and rape some victims post-mortem. He was arrested by the Shenyang police in 2003. After interrogation, he confessed to murder, rape, robbery and other various crimes. Wang Qiang was sentenced to death and executed in 2005. Altemio C. Sanchez is a Puerto Rican serial killer who is known to have raped and murdered at least 3 women and raped at least 9 to 15 girls and women in and around Buffalo, New York, during a 31-year span from 1975 to 2006. Sanchez is also known by the monikers Bike Path Rapist and Bike Path Killer. When Sanchez initially began to strangle and kill his victims, it is believed that he used a rope or cord. He would also beat and rape his victims during the attacks, and several of them are thought to have fought hard against him. In later years of Sanchez's crimes, he used a ligature, wire, or garrote to strangle and suffocate his victims. On January 15, 2007, police arrested Sanchez and charged him with murder. On August 15, 2007, Sanchez was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison. Gerard John Schaefer Jr. was an American murderer and suspected serial killer, known as the Killer Cop and the Hangman, who was convicted of the 1972 murder and mutilation of two teenage girls in Port St. Lucie, Florida. His victims were tortured, butchered, and decapitated. One was shot in the jaw. He is suspected of up to 26 further murders. Schaefer became known as the Killer Cop, as he was a sheriff's deputy in Martin County, Florida at the time of his initial arrest. He also became known as the Hangman, due to his favored practice of binding restrained women to trees with the hangman's noose around their neck. Prior to their torture and murder, Schaefer was sentenced to 2 terms of life imprisonment at his 1973 trial. He was stabbed to death by a fellow inmate while incarcerated at the facility in December 1995. In 2013, Amber Hill Burling was convicted of killing her Air Force veteran husband, Josh, by shoving him out of the 17th-story window of their high-rise apartment when she was 7 months pregnant. Hill Burling claims her husband attacked her after they argued about breaking up. She claimed the death was an accident caused by unusually thin windows in the couple's high-rise apartment. She told the court she acted in self-defense after Josh grabbed her by her shoulders during a heated argument. The prosecution said there is a taped confession in which Hill Burling says to her grandmother, "He was messing with the TV and I pushed him." His body was found crumpled on the roof of the garage. Amber was found dead in an apparent suicide in her prison cell at Mabel Bassett Correctional Center in Oklahoma in October 2016. Her death came 5 years after she was convicted of killing her husband Josh. Robert Joseph Silveria, the Boxcar murderer, was part of the Freight Train Riders of America, a boxcar gang that preys upon fellow rail-riding hobos. Arrested in March 1995 in a rail yard near Sacramento, California, Silveria was charged with the murder of transient William Pettit, found dead in a boxcar in Northern California. Silveria has also been linked to 13 other boxcar murders in Oregon, Utah, California, Arizona, Kansas, and Washington state, spanning from 1981 to 1995. The victims, mostly drifters, were stabbed or bludgeoned to death and robbed of their meager possessions. While in custody, Bobby claimed all his kills were gang-related, betraying his secret boxcar brotherhood by talking of the murders. Boxcar Bobby was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole in Oregon in 1998. Miyuki Ishikawa, a Japanese midwife and serial killer. Known as the Oni-sanba, demon midwife, Miyuki's murdered between 85 and 169 infants between 1944 and 1948. She was an experienced midwife and worked as a hospital director at the Kotobuki Maternity Hospital. Ishikawa chose to neglect numerous infants, many of whom died as a direct result of this abuse. The police initially found 5 dead bodies and later found over 40 more in the house of a mortician. 30 additional bodies were later discovered in a temple. She and several accomplices are believed to have murdered dozens of infants, a crime spree known as the Kotobuki-Sanin incident. Miyuki and her husband Takeshi Ishikawa were arrested in 1948 and sentenced to 8 and 4 years imprisonment respectively. Alexei Sukhaldin was a Soviet serial killer and cannibal. He killed and cannibalized 7 girls and women in Tatarstan. Sukhaldin committed his first murder in November 1979. He invited 22-year-old Yekaterina Ostrova to his home, took a rag-wrapped hammer and hit her on the head with it, tied her hands with a rope, and cut her throat. He drank her blood while she was still alive. When she died, he hung her corpse and mocked her before cutting off the soft tissues and eviscerating the internal organs. The remaining blood was disposed of in the bath. Sukhaldin then ate her heart, liver, and lungs. On June 4, 1985, Alexei Sukhaldin was arrested. On April 18, 1986 he was sentenced to execution by shooting. On July 29, 1987, the sentence was carried out. Gennady Modestovich Mikhasevic was a prolific Soviet serial killer. He murdered 36 women from 1971 to 1985 in Vitebsk, Polotsk, and the rural areas in the nearby regions of the Belarusian SSR. On the night of May 14, 1971, he encountered a young woman on the road and killed her. He murdered again in October 1971, and strangled 2 other women in 1972 near Vitebsk. Many of his murders were committed to facilitate rape. He invariably strangled or smothered his victims. In the year 1984 he killed 12 women. He was finally arrested in December 1985. After initial denial, he confessed and was sentenced to death and executed by firing squad on September 25, 1987, aged 40. Romulus Veres was a notorious serial killer from Romania, better known as the Man with the Hammer. During the 1970s, he was charged with 5 murders and several attempted murders, but never imprisoned on grounds of insanity. He had schizophrenia. Blaming the devil for his actions, he was known to rob, stalk, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. He would kill his victims with a hammer or by stabbing them with a knife. One victim was pregnant and found in a pool of blood. The neighbors thought she had given birth, but upon discovering that the woman had been hit in the head, she was rushed to the hospital and later survived. Veres set fire to the bodies of 2 of his later victims. In 1976, Romulus Veres was institutionalized in the State Psychiatric Hospital in Romania, where he died from liver disease in 1993. Kelly M. Cochran, 34, aka the Devil Woman of Michigan, who killed her lover and served his remains at a barbecue, has confessed to more murders. Cochran, who injected her husband with a lethal dose of heroin before smothering him with a pillow, and is suspected of serving her lover's remains to unsuspecting neighbors at a barbecue. She was sentenced to 65 years in prison in 2018 after admitting to killing her husband, Jason Cochran, but she was already serving a life sentence for killing and dismembering another lover, Chris Reagan, who vanished in 2014, and scattered his remains in the woods. Prosecutors claimed that Cochran had boasted in interviews to killing several other people and that she may well be a serial killer, with up to 9 bodies buried across the Midwest. Regardless, Kelly Cochran will spend the rest of her life behind bars. Luca Rocco Magnotta is a convicted Canadian murderer. He was convicted of murdering and dismembering June Lin. Lin was a Chinese international student. On May 25, a video titled, "One Lunatic, One Ice Pick," is posted on the web. It depicts a young male bound on a bed, initially alive and then lifeless. Then someone is seen repeatedly stabbing the corpse with an ice pick and dismembering the body with a knife. There are also acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. 10 days before the murder, another video was filmed showing cannibalism and was posted online. Authorities identify the victim of the gruesome killing and dismemberment as June Lin. On June 4, 2012, Magnotta was arrested in an internet cafe in Berlin on June 4, where he was sitting reading stories about himself. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He remains in a maximum security prison in Quebec. Vasile Kasaiuk, a Romanian serial killer, known as the Butcher of Iași and the Basarabian. He was known to rob, mutilate, and murder his victims. Kasaiuk lured them and then murdered them with an axe. He was arrested after a dog revealed 6 bodies buried at a small depth under his house in Lassie on September 7, 1935. He had a previous record of robberies. He confessed to 6 murders. In 5 years, the butcher had killed no fewer than 26 people, including a child. He buried the victims under the floors of several isolated houses and in a forest. He had ordered a special axe, designed to not slip out of his hand. During the reconstruction of one of the crimes, Vasile Kasaiuk tried to escape by fleeing. He was killed by several revolver shots on October 17, 1935. Rocky Beeman was an American serial killer who killed 3 people, including 2 fellow inmates in prison. On February 6, 2005, Rocky Beeman murdered Debbie Lacey. Beeman hit Lacey, tied her hands behind her back, and held her in water until she drowned. While serving a life sentence for the murder, Beeman murdered 2 inmates, both of whom served time for sex crimes against children. He would profess his hatred for sex offenders, saying that killing them gave him the best feeling he had in a long time. He pledged to continue targeting victims if he was not sentenced to death. "I'll do my best to eliminate every single one until one of 3 things happen. Someone kills me, I run out of people to kill, or they put me where I can kill no more." Death row. Beeman was sentenced to death but committed suicide on death row in 2020. Keith Hunter Jesperson is a Canadian-American serial killer who murdered at least 8 women in the United States during the early 1990s. He was known as the Happy Face Killer because he drew smiley faces on his many letters to the media and authorities. Many of his victims were sex workers and transients who had no connection to him. Strangulation was his preferred method of murdering, the same method he often used to kill animals as a child. His last victim was the crime that ultimately led to his capture. While he has claimed to have killed as many as 160 people, only 8 murders have been confirmed. He is currently serving 4 life sentences without possibility of parole at the Oregon State Penitentiary. Keith is quoted as saying, "It was their fate to die by my hands, like a car accident or illness." Darlene Gentry. In the early morning of November 9, 2005, her husband, Keith, got shot in the head. Darlene called 911 for help while her injured husband gurgled in the background, claiming that someone had broken in, taken all his guns and shot him. He was still alive when the first responders reached the scene, so they rushed him to the nearest hospital. However, his good fortune soon turned into misfortune as the police soon received word that he was brain dead. The authorities took Darlene to the hospital where she signed the consent forms to let them take him off of life support, resulting in his inevitable death. Keith's 2 life insurances added up to approximately $750,000. She was arrested on suspicion of murder on November 27, 2005. Darlene was sentenced to 60 years of imprisonment. Convicted serial killer and rapist Jimmy Maketa was a dangerous psychopath lacking remorse, who terrorized Western Cape communities for 9 months in 2005. He attacked both men and women. Lurking in the bushes, he would wait for his victims, who were usually drunk. Then he would attack them when they were most vulnerable. He would break into their homes, rape, and kill by hacking them into pieces with an axe or hitting them with a hammer. Maketa, 43, pleaded guilty and was convicted on 47 charges, including 13 murder charges, 3 attempted murder charges, 22 charges of rape, 1 of robbery with aggravating circumstances, 5 of housebreaking, 4 of assault with intent to commit grievous bodily harm, and 2 charges of kidnapping. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at a prison in Cape Town, South Africa. Valery Ashratyan, born 1958, was a Soviet serial killer, rapist, and child molester known as the Director. He was known to give coffee which was mixed with strong psychotropic drugs, rape, stab, and murder his victims between 1988 and 1990, in Moscow, Russia. Ashratyan received his nickname because he posed as film director Svetoslav Chaplygin, in order to gain the trust of the young women. He was previously convicted of over 20 rapes of girls and young women during the 1980s. In 1990, he confessed to 2 murders and admitted to 17 rapes. He killed 3 victims, and raped dozens of women. Valery Ashratyan was convicted of killing 2 women and was sentenced to death on June 18, 1992 and executed with a bullet to the head. Bruce McArthur, Toronto's most prolific serial killer and the oldest known serial killer in Canada. The Toronto serial homicides occurred between 2010 and 2017. McArthur was known as Santa for his seasonal employment at a local shopping mall. Authorities found evidence on McArthur's computer, grisly photos of his suspected victims kept as trophies. Police announced that they had found the dismembered skeletal remains of at least 3 people in 2 of 12 large planter boxes seized from the Leaside residence. He was arrested in 2018 and convicted of all 8 murders in 2019. On February 8, 2019, Bruce McArthur was sentenced to 8 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole for 25 years. He turned 71 on October 8, 2022. Margie Velma Barfield was an American serial killer who was convicted of 1 murder but who eventually confessed to 6 murders in total. She used rat poison to murder her victims. At 17 she married and gave birth to 2 children. After a fight with her husband, the house mysteriously caught on fire, killing him. She married Jennings Barfield. After an argument, Jennings became mysteriously ill. He contracted an illness and died of a heart attack. 2 separate couples that employed Velma to be a caretaker also became ill in her care and died. A new boyfriend, Stuart Taylor, also passed mysteriously. She was convicted in the end and was the first woman in the United States to be executed after the 1976 resumption of capital punishment and the first since 1962. She was also the first woman to be executed by lethal injection. Peter Woodcock was a Canadian serial killer and diagnosed psychopath. On September 15, 1956, 17-year-old Woodcock lured 7-year-old Wayne Mallett and then strangled him to death. Woodcock defecated next to the corpse. On October 6, 1956, Woodcock picked up 9-year-old Gary Morris. He drove the boy to Cherry Beach where he strangled and beat him to death. His body was found with a bite mark on his throat. On January 19, 1957, Woodcock approached 4-year-old Carol Boyce and then murdered her. She had been choked into unconsciousness and sexually molested. Woodcock was arrested on January 21, 1957. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity and he died of natural causes at the Penetanguishene Mental Health Center on March 5, 2010, his 71st birthday. Joseph Vacher, a French serial killer known as the French Ripper and the Southeast Ripper, murdered and mutilated 11 to 27 victims between 1894 and 1897. Vacher raped, stabbed, sodomized and disemboweled women, teenage boys, and girls who worked alone in the countryside as farm laborers. Prior to his spree he had served time in jail, seen a psychologist and spent time in a forensic hospital. Vacher claimed he was insane but was pronounced sane and fit to stand trial. He was arrested in 1897 and sentenced to death in 1898. In 1898, Joseph Vacher was executed by a guillotine at a prison in Bourg-en-Bresse, France, at dawn on December 31, 1898. He refused to walk to the scaffold under his own power and was dragged to the guillotine by the executioners. On the evening of January 18, 1986, Andrew Erdile stalked 23-year-old Robin Brandley and stabbed her 41 times with a knife. 2 years later on July 17, 1988, he shot 29-year-old Julie McGill. 2 months later in San Diego he killed 31-year-old Mary Ann Wells. His 4th victim, 18-year-old Tammy Irwin's corpse was found on the streets of Palm Springs on April 17, 1989. In March 1995, he forced Denise Manny into his car and drove her into the desert and shot her, undressed her, and left the corpse for scavengers. He killed 3 more women before he was arrested on April 23, 1997. He was sentenced to death and hung himself in his cell on Friday, November 2, 2018 at around 11:15 p.m.